Will the SEC's climate risk disclosure rule deliver for the climate? I'm Mark Drexler with the Climatographers, and I've been thinking about this question for a while. Think of this video as a thought piece, actually looking for reaction, contrary views, contrary data, because it's a really important question. And don't misunderstand, I am all in on climate risks. As you may know, I talk a lot about climate risk, and societal climate risks are generally being substantially underestimated today. That's because we're far too focused on what's most likely to happen, what outcomes are highest probability outcomes. We're far too little focused on the higher consequence outcomes that actually generate much of the risk that's out there from climate change. And companies are not immune to this. Companies are substantially underestimating their own climate risks for exactly the same reason. Companies should absolutely be assessing their climate risks, whether physical, regulatory, transition, brand, legal, systemic, or otherwise. Companies should be using a variety of tools, including pre-mortems and scenario planning. Companies should be called out for greenwashing, greenwishing, and a lack of transparency when it comes to climate risk issues. And the same goes for financial institutions and investors. But there are some big questions that come up in the context of the SEC rule that's proposed in the United States. First, will mandatory risk disclosure generate the information financial institutions and investors would need for better climate risk management? Second, what are the potential implications of risk disclosure mandates for how companies actually assess their climate risks? Third, what are the potential implications of climate disclosure mandates for corporate climate commitments themselves? So let's start with question one and the issue of how we're measuring climate risk. Disclosure of scopes 1 through 3 emissions is a very common proxy for climate risk. But is there a causal relationship between scopes 1, 2, or 3 emissions and the risks a company faces from climate change? Probably not. From climate policy? Maybe. But even that depends on all kinds of policy and economic assumptions. It depends on carbon pricing. It depends on pass-through rules. It depends on all kinds of things. So there is no obvious correlation that I can see between scopes 1 through 3 emissions and climate risk. And what about the scenarios that are being used to assess climate risk? When you think about this graphic of a long-tail distribution, there are an enormous number of potential but plausible climate risk scenarios. Those scenarios can vary dramatically when it comes to their scope, direct, indirect, systemic, or timeframes, 5, 10, 50 years, or the variables included, from climate policy and carbon pricing to climate sensitivity and tipping points. And that's just a few of many potential variables that come into play in taking a look at climate risk assessment. And last but certainly not least, the question of, are you being risk adverse or are you not being risk adverse? Are you focusing on the expected risk as shown in this graphic, or are you focusing on the long tail of the risk distribution? One interesting example of this is that risk analysis for offshore oil rigs in Norway is based on the 10,000-year rogue wave. Not the 50-year, not the 5-year, not the 100-year, the 10,000-year rogue wave. And if you applied the same kind of approach to climate risk assessment, you would universally generate an, oh my God, don't invest in me message. Now, of course, it's not what most climate risk disclosures tend to say. And in fact, the first climate risk disclosure by a major U.S. coal-fired utility. And before you ask, I have tried to find this document for a while now, and I've never been able to find it since it's 20 plus years old. But this was a coal-fired utility in the US, one of the largest CO2 emitters in the US. It did the first real climate risk assessment, and it concluded that climate policy was not material to the company. And the question was, how could that conceivably be? It turns out that the scenario involved very gradual and relatively weak climate policy. It also assumed the ability to purchase as many cheap offsets as the company needed for compliance. So in that context, it's not that surprising that it concluded that climate policy was not material. And who's to say that was a bad scenario? You could argue that it's been accurate for the last 20 years. When you think about climate risk disclosure, it's worth noting that interpreting corporate risk disclosures will require in-depth scenario transparency. What was the company assuming about all kinds of relevant climate risk variables? And what that means is that since there are all kinds of plausible scenarios and all kinds of plausible assumptions about climate futures and about climate policy futures, comparing risk disclosures is likely to be very difficult in the absence of standardized risk scenario. But standardized risk scenarios don't actually make any sense, given the fact that risk in many ways is in the eye of the beholder. And there are many reasons that different decision makers, different companies, different sectors would use different scenarios. So in terms of our first question, will mandatory risk disclosure generate the information financial institutions and investors would need for better climate risk management? To me, it seems far from clear, and it seems that it's likely to vary considerably across companies and sectors. So let's move on to the second question. What are the potential implications of risk disclosure mandates for how companies assess their climate risks? Pre-mortems and scenario planning are important climate risk assessment tools. And both of those really should include aggressive futures. The problem here is that if you include aggressive futures and you end up with an oh my God risk, as I mentioned in a prior slide, companies legitimately are not going to want to disclose that oh my God risk. But in the context of mandatory risk disclosure, does that mean they would never have considered those scenarios to begin with? And this is the crux of the question when it comes to mandatory risk disclosure. Can you actually do the kind of scenario planning that companies have historically done if you are potentially liable for the results of that scenario planning and your disclosure of the results? And if you transition to a mandatory risk disclosure framework, won't that mean that legal departments end up taking over what has been a strategic planning function? And if that happens, lawyers will appropriately be reviewing every step of that whole risk assessment and risk disclosure process. And if that happens, won't the result be boilerplate risk assessments and disclosures that almost inevitably deliver as little information and that create as little risk of their own as possible? So with regard to question 2, will mandatory climate risk disclosures have unwanted consequences for corporate climate risk assessments? As far as I can tell, that's inevitable given the incentives and the liabilities involved. Can those consequences be mitigated? That's an interesting question, and I'd love to understand how they can be mitigated. So let's move on to the third question. What are the potential implications of climate disclosure mandates, not only for risk disclosure per se, but for corporate climate commitments to begin with? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this third question, but for exactly the same reasons that we just covered in the second question, to the extent that voluntary commitments could create liabilities under the SEC disclosure rule, which you can't eliminate as a possibility, it's inevitable that you would end up with unwanted consequences for corporate climate commitments. How significant that will be, whether that can be mitigated, is a great question. So to close, I'm trying to understand how a mandatory risk disclosure will deliver for climate change mitigation. The commentary around the proposed SEC risk disclosure rule seems almost universally enthusiastic, at least in terms of people concerned about climate change and concerned about climate risk. But there is a tightrope here between the intentions and the potential consequences in terms of actual behaviors. And I've laid a number of those out in this short video. And what I'm curious about is there something misguided about the observations that I've made? And I would love to hear about that if that's the case. And I'd love to hear about any work that you're aware of that would help me further dig into these questions. Drop me a note, and thanks for watching.